every year around this time, we are required by state act to present the proposed preliminary budget. Bob, if you could advance, please. So quickly, we're going to go through the budget timeline, the challenges, of course, of preparing this budget at this time, some of the highlights, and then a few closing comments. You can go to the next slide. So as was discussed in finance 2 weeks ago, Mr. DeBello, is that about right? We talked about the timeline of preparing the budget and all the different dates and milestones that we have to hit by law. The first one, of course, is this presentation that we're doing tonight. The next will be, of course, to make the proposed preliminary budget public and allow inspection of that budget for an intended adoption of this proposed preliminary budget at the January board meeting. And this will allow us to keep our normal schedule of trying to get the final budget done by the end of May. And then we have, of course, some other requirements in there if we're going to apply for referendum exceptions, and then get those in by March the 4th. You can advance the slide, please. And then, there we go. And then, of course, all the way down to the bottom where we see the adoption of the final budget, we're targeting for the end of May. This past year, obviously because of the lovely COVID disruptions, we ended up in the first week of June, I believe it was. But that still gave us in the business office and our tax collectors enough time to do the things we need to do by that 6:30 deadline of getting invoices out. One thing I did add in there was that the top line on referendum questions, I'm just putting it out there just so that folks know that if we were ever to decide to go that route, we would have to get a question up to the county electors by March the 19th. And if we were going to do that, the primary where the question would come forth would be on May 18th, which of course would really make the budget schedule a bit tighter than it is. You can advance the slide, please. So the challenges, I'm going to sound a bit like a broken record. For those of you who have heard me go through this before, we're only 4 months into the current fiscal year, so we don't have a lot of data, only 2 months into the school year. And then, of course, there's a pandemic on top of everything else, which has changed a lot of our data and made it a bit of an anomaly. On the state budget side, a lot of unknowns. I always post the education subsidy, transportation, special education subsidies. We're watching this closely as I know Mr. DeBello and I do. We continually look at what's going on at the state level, what's going on in their budgeting process. Do they have do they have plans on filling some of their budget gaps that they have, and how do they plan on doing it? So we're watching those numbers. We're watching those numbers and those events very intently, and I'm interested to know if this will be a crazy state budget year like it was about 3 years ago. I think it was, considering where we are. You can advance the slide, please. So looking at some of the major items on the expenditure side, as is usual, our wages and benefits account for about 75% of the total budget. So we're talking about the 2021 budget of about 172 million. About 70% of that has to do with wages and benefits. We are a service business, of course. Professional wages, just year over year growth, about $1.7 million increase. That's through step movement and that type of stuff through our contract. Our administrative support, about 473. And then, of course, we always build into our model the growth over the next couple of years as far as needs within our personnel. And those numbers are displayed there. So all in all, about a $3.5 million increase. This comes right off of our 7-year projection. So this model is built and is going forward, and then we'll tweak it as we go. Taxes and benefits, related expenditures, PSERS, again, another hike this year from 34.5% of wages to 35 and almost 35.5%. That's an 8.6% increase, or it equates to about $2 million to our budget line. Medical and dental health benefits, about estimating about at this point at least a 5% increase over last year. We did go through our first pass with Rischini, our health benefits consultant. They're always slightly north of where I am. Mrs. Leese and I work through this closely. Always a little bit more conservative than we are. We basically do ours based on the trends. So that's where our trends look like they're going. And of course, the payroll taxes. You can advance the slide, please. So when you look at everything side by side, looking at the 2021 budget where we are now and looking at the 21-22 proposed preliminary budget, we're looking at an increase overall of about $10 million as it stands right now. The interesting things, as I said before, the biggest chunk of those things are on the salaries and the benefits piece. Of course, they always are. And then some other items going on down the row as planned. What's interesting to me, as always, is that bottom right number, which shows me almost a 6% increase year over year, at least at this stage. You can advance the slide, please. That number is always interesting to me because when we look at the next slide, the first thing we see up there is organic revenues growing at about 1.5%. So the spread between the two, almost 6% to 1.5%, there's quite a difference. But in looking at that 1.5% would equate to about $1.6 million. Delinquent taxes, simply because of the time that we're in, I'm watching a slowdown in that, as we discussed in finance. A little bit of a slowdown on those collections, so that's dropped down a little bit. On the state level, again, watching this very closely. This is about, the state is about 22% of our overall budget from revenue standpoint. And we're looking at, always we estimate the basic education funding subsidy to be the year prior, because we're always nervous about what the state is going to do. A little bit more nervous this year about that. Transportation subsidy really not expected to move very much. And of course, there is increased funding for the PSERS and that's the retirement and the employer share of Social Security taxes of about 1.2 million. That comes just simply because we're spending more on salaries. Just so we know, that's our halfway back. Federal, which accounts for less than 0.5%. Not expecting any changes there. So if you look at the revenue side by side, we're looking at about $167 million this year to $170 million next year. Again, a growth factor, a percentage of about 1.7%. So, and the most of that, of course, the bigger numbers of that are at the state level, mainly because of that PSERS number. You can advance, please. So if I look at what that means when we start adding all these numbers up, they're pretty big numbers. When we start looking at them, adding them up, we see about $170 million in revenues, about 182 in expenditures. We always appropriate about $4 million from our fund balance to help cover the differences. And also long-term planning of funds we've set aside in the past that we're now using for increases in those retirement numbers that I spoke about before. Looking at a gap in our budget right now as it stands, we still have a long way to go, of about $7.2 million. So that's the number we're looking at, sharpening our pencils very quickly. You can move on, Bob, please. So just so we know, and we can refresh everybody, if you haven't been in one of our finance meetings, the Act 1 index right now is, for the coming year, is 3%. Referendum exceptions, I'm looking at probably about $1.75 million that could possibly be recovered there if we decided to use those. We always apply for them. We haven't used them in quite some time. Our next steps, obviously, is to deep dive, do the ground up approach that we always do every year. Start looking at the data and the trend data for this coming year, figure out what COVID is doing to all of that, and keep a close eye on Harrisburg. That was a pretty quick run through. So the next steps would be, as there is an item in there for me to make this proposed preliminary budget public come January, so we can let the clock tick, to approve this so we can take our next step into getting a final budget in January, or getting it approved in January so we can move forward with our final by the end of the year.